All right, hello. Welcome everyone to Chevalier's Online. We're so excited to have everyone here for a very exciting evening with Ariel Sabar, whose book VERITAS just came out last week. Ariel is an award-winning journalist with his work appearing in the New York Times, Harper's, The Atlantic, This American Life, and many, many other prestigious publications. His debut novel, or his debut book, My Father's Paradise, won the National Book Critics Circle Award. And he's also, if you're interested, doing a fun scavenger hunt about Veritas on his Twitter, and I highly recommend checking it out. So I'm going to turn it over to Ariel. He's going to give a very enlightening presentation about this book, and then we're going to go into an audience Q&A after. Until then, please stay on mute, but I'll give you the go-ahead for when you can start asking your questions. So Ariel, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Chelsea. I really appreciate it. And thanks very much to Chevalier's Books for hosting. I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm very fond of the city, and it's a treat to be able to speak to everybody here virtually from where I live now, which is Washington, D.C. So I'm going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes, and then really excited to open this up to questions. I wanted to start by reading part of the book's prologue because it puts readers in the room at kind of a key moment in the story, a moment that will resonate in different ways as the rest of the book unfolds. On September 18th, 2012, a group of international scholars gathered in a building across from the Vatican for an obscure academic conference on Egypt's earliest Christians. The week-long program looked much like those of years past, with highly specialized lectures on Egyptian linguistics, monastery libraries, and the wills of abbots. But at 7 o'clock that evening, the conference lost any semblance of the ordinary. A senior Harvard University professor rose to the lectern to make an astonishing announcement, one that a select group of journalists was at that very moment transmitting across the globe. She had discovered an ancient scrap of papyrus with the power to convulse the Roman Catholic Church. The professor, a 58-year-old historian named Karen King, was a well-known and deeply respected figure in the field of biblical studies. Harvard had recently promoted her to its Hollis Professorship of Divinity, the oldest endowed chair in America and one of the most prestigious posts in the study of Christianity. She was familiar to the public too, as a best-selling author and TV commentator on the first centuries of the faith. But the events of September 2012 would put her in a brighter and crueler spotlight than any she had known before. In a room overlooking the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, King told the audience of elite scholars that she had already given the discovery, a name. I dubbed it, just simply for reference purposes, the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. So that's part of the prologue. And then, I wanted to sort of give you a sense of how this all plays out after this announcement. This little piece of ancient paper would make the network TV news, the front pages of the Boston Globe and the New York Times. It would inspire op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times, and bits by Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert on Comedy Central. Public reaction to it covered the waterfront. From conservatives, the devout, and the Holy See, there was dismissal, disbelief, and dismay. Among progressive Christians, there was excitement about the prospects of a more tolerant and egalitarian faith. Atheists, for their part, saw it as one more piece of evidence that nothing in the Bible was believable. The hashtag Jesus' Wife lit up Twitter, and for some time, the world of biblical scholarship had no idea what had hit it. There was good reason for all this uproar. Never before had an ancient text alluded to a married Jesus. Tradition had long portrayed the central figure of Christianity as a celibate, lifelong bachelor whose only spouse, if one could call it that, was the church. But that wasn't the only reason for the drama. Its leading players were in many ways the very embodiments of reason and faith. On one side, you had Harvard, the richest and most powerful university in the world, a beacon of the Enlightenment and of prestigious, impartial scholarship. On the other, the Roman Catholic Church, the richest and most powerful religious institution in the world, a place of spiritual mystery and cloistered intrigue. And there, on that fall day in 2012, when Dr. King made her announcement, they were quite literally staring each other down across a narrow cobblestone street, Via Paolo VI, named after a pope who vociferously defended the priestly right of celibacy and the exclusion of women from the priesthood. My own interest in the story was something else beside. I had returned to it after that first explosion of publicity because I'd been there from almost the very start. Smithsonian Magazine had gotten advance word of Dr. King's discovery, and in August 2012, asked if I could basically drop everything and fly to Harvard to interview her, then travel to Rome to be in the room when she made her announcement to the world's top experts in the language and culture of Egypt's earliest Christians. That meant that I had gotten access to the protagonists earlier than any other journalists. I was part of the machinery that had helped introduce the papyrus to the world. I was the only journalist in the room beside the Vatican when Dr. King revealed her discovery to fellow scholars. And I think that's part of what fired this obsession with getting to the bottom of it, this need to know, this compulsion that I think any serious journalist has to have, which is not just to report the news, but to run it to ground, to figure out if a story, particularly a sensational one told by a powerful institution, could withstand scrutiny. And in an era when the very idea of facts is under attack, I think that part of the journalistic calling is particularly important. But I had no idea what I was getting into when I decided to take this on. I had no sense of how twisted and upside down everything would become. Now, before I get too much farther, and because not everyone will remember the news coverage back in 2012, it might make sense to walk through some of the basics. Papyrus is an ancient predecessor to paper. It's where paper got its name. It's made from the dried and pressed stalks of reeds that once flourished along the banks of the Nile. And it was the predominant writing surface in the Mediterranean world at the dawn of Christianity. And this particular piece of papyrus is the size and shape of a business card. On its front side are 8 lines of handwritten text in Coptic, which is the language, again, of Egypt's earliest Christians. It's the last phase of the Egyptian language, a language that goes all the way back, of course, to the hieroglyphic script. That's the sort of oldest form of Egyptian. Coptic is the most modern form, although it's still quite ancient. And Coptic copies of the Gospels are among the oldest surviving copies in any language. And for a simple reason, Egypt is very dry. It's a land of vast deserts, and its arid climate preserved ancient texts that rainier parts of the world turned to mush. Dr. King decided to call this fragment the Gospel of Jesus' Wife. And that title, I should be very clear, is printed nowhere on the papyrus itself. And importantly, the fragment is missing all of its margins. It appears as if it had broken off or been cut from the middle of some larger sheet of papyrus. That larger sheet, in turn, would have presumably been part of some still larger codex or ancient book. So not only is this presumably larger codex missing, each of the surviving 8 lines on this bit of papyrus is missing its beginning and end. So, parallel might be to sort of imagine, say, if 2,000 years from now, every copy of Huckleberry Finn or Pride and Prejudice had vanished, except for a small scrap of sentence fragments resected from the middle of a random page. And yet, the odd thing about the papyrus was that for Dr. King, the randomly surviving sentence fragments formed a coherent story with beginning, middle, and end. In her interpretation, the 8 truncated lines were evidence of a previously unknown gospel. She knew that believers had hotly debated the role of marriage and sexuality in a properly Christian life in the 2nd century AD. The Gospel of Jesus' Wife, she proposed, must have been a previously undocumented side in that debate, a group of ancient Christians who not only approved of marriage, sex, and women's discipleship for themselves, but traced it all the way back to Jesus himself. Dr. King was renowned for just this sort of work. She had risen to the top of her field by wresting meaning from Christianity's most cryptic and fragmentary texts. The papyrus, in her view, depicted a dialogue between Jesus and his disciples over the qualifications of Mary Magdalene to be his disciple. And the show-stopping line sits in the very center of the fragment. It's right there, dead center, and it would make headlines the world over. It says simply this, quote, Jesus said to them, quote, my wife, end quote. What words come directly before and directly after that sentence are wholly unknown. But in her lecture in Rome, in her scholarly paper, and in news releases and YouTube videos circulated by Harvard, King presented the world a portrait of Jesus never before found in the ancient world. A man married to Mary Magdalene, a proud husband defending his wife against skeptics questioning her worthiness as a disciple. A savior teaching the disciples that marriage on earth is a symbol of believers' reunion in the afterlife with their divine twins in a higher realm. King suspected that this gospel of Jesus' wife must have been somehow suppressed in antiquity, perhaps because its message about Jesus' humanity and sexuality and about Mary Magdalene's leadership was at odds with the politics of the church fathers as they courted support from patriarchal Rome. This gospel was perhaps simply too hot to handle at a time when Christianity cast a dim eye on the physical body and its earthly needs. King reminded people that the New Testament Gospels themselves tell us nothing about Jesus' marital status. If you read the canonical Gospels, it doesn't say one way or the other whether Jesus had a spouse or whether he didn't. And it's to judge from the surviving evidence, it's only in the 2nd century that believers begin to portray Jesus as celibate. Perhaps because missionaries had by then largely abandoned the idea of converting the Jews and had moved on instead to the world of Greco-Roman Gentiles, many of whom exalted the ascetic life. This fragment's surviving words were also an almost perfect fit for the theories Dr. King had spent her career writing and talking about. Her scholarship was devoted to recovering the lost voices of women in early Christianity. None of those women was more central to her work than Mary Magdalene. Magdalene was one of Jesus' closest followers, an independently wealthy woman from the Galilee who follows him to Jerusalem, watches the crucifixion, and discovers the empty tomb. Yet, for centuries, the Roman Catholic Church, and really much of Western culture, falsely portrayed her as a repentant prostitute. King had long lamented this false but stubbornly persistent portrayal. It was a slander concocted by popes to silence a powerful female voice in the early church. The papyrus seemed to redeem Mary Magdalene twice over. Not only was she as fit as the male disciples to preach the good news, she was Jesus' wife, as beloved as she was human. There were enough words on this tiny fragment to create real problems for the church. Priests, of course, took a vow of celibacy, in part in imitation of a supposedly wifeless Jesus. The church didn't ordain women priests because, its theologians argued, Jesus chose no women for his very innermost circle. These 8 partial lines of Coptic packed enough firepower to rattle both of these central pillars of Catholic tradition. Yet, even at the beginning, there was this unnerving sense among other scholars that something about the papyrus was off. You had the provocative title, The Gospel of Jesus' Wife, the key line at the very center of what was supposed to be a random fragment, the decision to unveil it beside the seat of the Roman Catholic Church, the almost made-for-TV tableau of Harvard versus the Vatican, of reason with a capital R dropping a bomb at the doorstep of faith. I'm not sure how many people have read The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown or seen the 2006 movie with Tom Hanks. But because the Da Vinci Code sold something like 80 million copies, I've no doubt that many people have heard of it. In a nutshell, a Harvard professor of religion discovers a Catholic conspiracy to bury evidence of Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, a secret whose exposure would supposedly hobble the church. The book's fictional Harvard professor finds an important clue to this long suppressed secret by way of a cryptic message inscribed on a little piece of papyrus. And so the question presented itself: was Karen King's papyrus an authentically ancient manuscript? Was it just a fluke of case of life imitating art? Or was something darker at play? And those were some of the questions I was left with after filing that first deadline story for Smithsonian Magazine in 2012. I didn't have time then to pursue it further. I'm a freelance journalist and I had to move on. I took on different assignments from other magazines on different subjects. But I remember those questions I had in that first story didn't go away. You know, some stories you write, you sort of forget about as soon as you file them. Some of them really linger, and this was one of those stories. So in 2015, 3 years after the Smithsonian story, I Googled around to see what had become of the Gospel of Jesus' wife. Scientific tests that Dr. King had commissioned seemed to have found no signs of modern forgery. Among her backers was an illustrious NYU professor, considered one of the world's leading experts on papyrus. But many of King's colleagues, liberal, conservative, and everywhere in between, believed that something was off. Not so much the Da Vinci Code, Da Vinci-esque content, but its strange, unprecedented handwriting, the grammatical errors, even the way the words were strung together. The partial lines of text in the Gospel of Jesus' wife, a scholar discovered, could be cleverly constructed by cutting phrases from the Gospel of Thomas and reassembling them to say something new, like a kidnapper who fashions a ransom note from words snipped from different magazines. For those who aren't familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, it's a non-canonical gospel thought to have been written as early as the 1st century, maybe a century later. It has a list of, it's basically a list of 114 so-called secret sayings of Jesus. Some of these sayings you'll find sort of equivalents of in the 4 Gospels, some you won't, but it's a sort of mysterious text, and it became clear to a number of scholars that you could essentially, that the Gospel of Jesus' wife was a kind of pastiche of phrases cut and pasted from this other gospel. Now, after 3 years, scholarly opinion had moved decidedly toward the idea that the fragment was a fake, but still there was uncertainty. On academic blogs, debates raged over whether King had made a historic find or whether she had somehow wound up at the center of an audacious hoax. I spent some time catching up on the latest peer-reviewed journal articles, and I noticed that a baffling question had yet to be answered. Where in the world did this papyrus come from? What was its provenance? Karen King had told reporters in 2012 that a private collector had given it to her, but she had refused to identify him. She had said that he wanted anonymity and that she would honor his wishes. Where he lived, what he did for a living, King wouldn't say. The farthest I'd gotten when I'd pressed while writing my piece for Smithsonian was that he was a complete stranger, a cipher who'd emailed her out of the blue one day to say he had an interesting manuscript he'd like her to translate. His request for anonymity wasn't unreasonable. Many private collectors prefer to stay out of the public eye. But as a journalist, I knew that sources mattered. When a complete stranger shows up in a newsroom with a sensational scoop, it's not enough just to vet the information. A diligent reporter will also investigate the source. Who are they? What's their history? How might they benefit from a particular piece of information becoming public? What ulterior motives might they have for requesting anonymity? Do they have a record of being trustworthy? Is there anyone who can vouch for their bona fides? So the final source for this discovery, and I think one of the reasons that the papyrus generated as much publicity as it did, was Dr. King. And she was an esteemed historian at Harvard, her reputation seemingly beyond reproach. But what about her source? Isn't a chain only as strong as its weakest link? In the fall of 2015, in a dry spell between assignments, I decided to search for this anonymous collector to figure out who he was. If the truth about the Gospel of Jesus' wife were ever to see daylight, I felt, the path to it lay in the shadows of this faceless man. But how to get to him? Despite appeals from journalists and her own colleagues, Dr. King would say nothing. This man, this private collector, had been so helpful to her. He agreed to everything she'd asked, that she felt duty-bound to respect his only real request, which was, don't tell the world who I am. So there was this huge roadblock. Unlike some journalists setting out on an investigation, I had no court files or police records to work from. I had no sworn witness statements, no deep throat source who could hand me the whole story on a platter. I would have to fit together a puzzle whose thousands of pieces felt deliberately scattered and hidden. I think the only thing I had going for me at first was a wonderful editor at The Atlantic magazine who believed that no matter how it ended, I'd have a detective story. Even if I found nothing, the hunt for answers might be a tale worth telling. I had no intention of setting the bar that low. I hoped to return with something, but I was grateful when she told me to trust my instincts and follow the clues wherever they led. The fruits of that first investigation appeared in a story I wrote for The Atlantic in 2016. And now, after 2 additional years of full-time shoe leather reporting, it led to this book, VERITAS, which sweeps far beyond the magazine story into worlds I never knew existed. I followed leads to 12 American states and to Germany, Italy, Norway, and Switzerland. I spent weeks in libraries squinting at small type in decades-old phone books, tracing the movements of characters whose lives spiral through the story. I knocked on doors in small towns from southern Montana to southern Germany, following leads from one house to the next. My path would eventually lead from the halls of the Vatican and Harvard to the headquarters of the former headquarters of the East German Stasi, before winding back to rural Florida, where I discovered one of the most fascinating men I'd ever written about. On paper, Walter Fritz looked like an unremarkable local, 50 years old, married, RV owner, licensed to fish and hunt. But once I started digging, and once he started talking, I found a man whose life bore a Da Vinci Code-like stamp long before Dan Brown ever set pen to paper. I found a man both animated and seemingly scarred by the complex cross-currents of sexuality and faith. The relationship he'd formed with Karen King, I found, was as enigmatic as his own life story. How did this complete stranger ensnare one of the world's leading historians of early Christianity, a woman who'd grown up tough in Montana cow country, a skeptic who prided herself on her ability to dismantle and to skewer the church's fictions? How does he convince her to stake so much of her reputation on a manuscript that even she knew was suspect? The usual story is one of con man and dupe, of deceiver and deceived, forger and fool. But the deeper I went, the more complicated the truth became, and the trickier the moral questions. If a truth is important enough, can one use a lie to advance it? Does a righteous end justify dishonest means? VERITAS is a work of both investigative journalism and narrative nonfiction. On its surface, it's an international detective story, a mystery at the crossroads of desire and faith. If I've succeeded, however, it will leave readers thinking about and wrestling with much larger questions about the slipperiness of truth and the seductions of belief. Thank you. So I'll hand it back to you, Chelsea.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. We're going to open up to questions from the audience, but I have a couple I'd like to start with. And one is just very high level. Where does the title come from?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. The title VERITAS, sort of well known as the motto of Harvard University. You find it on T-shirts, posters, pendants of every kind. But it's not a gimmicky reference to that. I think, the temptation is, he wrote a book that involves a Harvard professor. He threw VERITAS on there, as a way to sort of goose sales. Not true. The VERITAS, of course, is the Latin word for truth. And I think it resonated for me in a number of ways, and it winds up actually playing a very central role in the story of itself, as readers will see when they come to its conclusion. But one of the things that was really interesting to me are the different pathways to truth that people take, depending on their profession or their proclivities or where they happen to find themselves at a particular moment. So, as a journalist, I am professedly an empiricist. I believe that there are discernible, knowable facts out in the world that a reporter can go find by asking questions, by looking through documents, by spending time in libraries. We may not always get it right the first time. There may be some bad facts mixed in with the good ones, but we're sort of on the curve sort of bends towards truth. On the other hand, you have devout believers who I think are willing to accept in certain parts of their lives, and certainly in the spiritual parts of their lives, truths that they can't necessarily pin down, that aren't verifiable in a scientific way, that don't have footnotes attached to them. And that's okay. That's part of the spiritual truths, where we can approach them in our own ways, in church, in the synagogue, in a mosque, wherever we happen to worship, where we don't need that kind of empirical evidence in the same way that we might as a scientist or as a journalist say. And then finally, I think in this other category, this is something I really only learned in looking at Dr. King's scholarship, is she is a postmodern theorist, and postmodernists don't really believe in the idea of an objective reality. There's a sense that we all sort of have our own truths, and truth sort of depends on where you're standing. And truth is basically a function of who gets to tell the story. So if you're shouting loud enough, your version of the truth becomes reality. If you have power, if you have a bullhorn, then your language essentially creates reality. And so what fascinates me about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife's story is you have all three of those sort of ways of knowing that intersect in this one story. And what happens when they intersect in a single story? What happens when they intersect in a single institution, like the Harvard Divinity School, for instance? Or even within the same individual, Dr. Karen King, who is very much a believer. There are people who will try to take pot shots and say she's trying to destroy Christianity. That's not true at all, and it's not fair. She is a Christian believer. She's a progressive Christian. For her, history is the pathway to stronger faith. That's her sort of philosophy. But she's also someone who is interested in the ways in which telling different stories about Christianity can broaden spiritual experiences for Christians. So it's a long answer to a good question.
Thank you for that. Out of curiosity, you're, as a journalist, very used to matters of fact-checking, credibility, verifying your sources, and you would expect the same out of academia, but in this case, that wasn't the first instinct. Was that strange for you coming from the outside into this world?
Yeah, it was a little bit strange. I mean, I think even for the Smithsonian story, I was surprised that Dr. King had not commissioned any scientific testing on the papyrus before she went public. To me, even then, it's if you're going to make a major announcement, and if you're inviting journalists in before you make that public announcement, and you're inviting reporters in from the Boston Globe and the New York Times and Smithsonian Magazine, you're just exposing yourself in a huge way, and not to have done sort of every possible check you could do before going public was a little bit surprising. And it was especially surprising after 2 out of the 3 peer reviewers that the Harvard Theological Review commissioned. So Dr. King had submitted her article, on the papyrus to the Harvard Theological Review. It's a century-old, very distinguished journal, very eminent in the field. And the Harvard Theological Review sent her article out to eminent double-blind peer reviewers, and 2 out of the 3 scholars they sent it to came back saying, "Oof, we think this is a forgery." And even after that pushback, Dr. King did not do scientific testing, did not reach out to the kinds of experts in Coptic papyri. So she had consulted an expert in Greek papyri, not in Coptic Christian papyri, not the sort of world's top experts that you would have expected before taking such a risk with her reputation and making such a splash. So it puzzled me a little bit. It did, I'll be honest, but it wasn't something I fully developed until I did the research for this book. And there are many revelations in the book that have not been previously disclosed about the kind of corner cutting that both Dr. King and the Harvard Theological Review did before publishing this article.
Quick note, anyone can jump in at any time with questions. And we've got one in the chat from Judy, who's curious how this whole ordeal affected Dr. King's reputation.
I mean, my sense in talking to other scholars, and I talk to scholars all the time because I write a lot about professors and the work they do, is that it's certainly, there's no question it's taken a hit. I mean, you can't announce something this publicly and then have that sort of level of scrutiny that comes with it. I mean, one scholar told me that being a professor at Harvard is like riding a tiger. It's great when you're on the tiger's back, but if you fall off, it's terrible. And so you're on this much higher sort of platform or pedestal as a professor at Harvard, and that gives you tremendous power to speak to the world about your academic scholarship. But when something goes amiss, the level of scrutiny and the schadenfreude that, if that's how you pronounce that word, that accompanies that is that much crueler and harsher. So I think certainly her reputation has suffered as a result.
Something I'm curious about is, your book is structured in 5 acts, and you're dealing with a very, very sensational subject. But your writing itself avoids kind of dipping into high melodrama. I was curious if it was difficult to find a balance between like a very even-keeled analytical voice and, you know, being a Da Vinci Code-esque thriller completely, and if you ever considered writing it another way.
You know, that's a really good, it's a really smart question, actually. I really appreciate you asking that. I really felt that in a book that was about presenting, sort of gathering all this evidence, all these facts, that it was really important for me to, as a journalist and as a writer, have a very understated tone. I've written pieces for magazines where I have more voice, where I'm trying to be more, you know, sort of clever or something, more turns of phrase that play with language. I really felt that it was important to deliberately really pull that back in a story like this, partly because the facts speak for themselves, I feel like, in many ways, and partly because I wanted readers to come to their own conclusions about where what this all added up to. I mean, it's really good writing advice I sort of believe in. I don't know who first said it, but you never want to give readers the sense that you feel something more strongly than you want them to. You want to create space for the reader to have the reaction and that you're not sort of foisting it on them. And if I wrote this in a melodramatic way, if I sort of shouted too loudly or came to conclusions for the reader, I think it would be off-putting. And so I think the way you control that as a writer, I'm not claiming to that. I don't have a guiding hand. Obviously I do. I wrote the book, but I think the way you do that is through structure. You don't do it through tone. So you want to write in a very plain way, clear language as much as possible, but you want to use structure, this sort of 5-act structure, to make sure that there's always a level of suspense that sort of drives people through the narrative. But really, yeah, it was a tough balance, and there were certainly places in the editing and in revision, I'm like, ooh, yeah, I went over the top there. Got to pull that back. That's too strong. So yeah, it's a really good question.
Great. Stephen, and you go into this pretty in-depth in the book, but Stephen is asking if you can talk a little about how the issue with legitimacy of this gospel of Jesus' wife was revealed over the years.
Say that it was.
So he's curious, like, how ultimately it's been proven fake, it's a forgery.
Yeah.
And how that process was.
Sure. So if anyone who has not read the book, warning, there's a lot of spoilers here, but if you go to my website under the Gospel of Jesus' Wife tab, there's a 9-page document for people who really want to go deep. It's annotated with sources and citations. If you want to see all of the scholarly articles and all the sources for the sort of the evidence of forgery, it's relatively long, but I know some people like to really geek out on this stuff, and it's really, really fun, I think, to go through some of that evidence. So if you really want to go deep, check out that PDF. It's on my website under the Gospel of Jesus' Wife tab. It's a great resource, and it'll direct you towards some materials. But essentially, there were a number of big breakthroughs. I mean, one is that when scholars are trying to figure out whether a manuscript is authentic, one of the things they do is look at the handwriting. So in antiquity, we think of our own handwriting today in modernity. All of us have our own individual handwriting. No one's handwriting is the same. Well, back in antiquity, there weren't a whole lot of people who could write. There were specially trained scribes. Many of them were slaves, who were all basically trained in sort of a uniform style of handwriting. That style of handwriting sort of changes through the decades, through the centuries. But there are well-known sort of categories of handwriting. The handwriting on this papyrus is really ugly. It's unprecedented in antiquity. The top scholars in paleography is the fancy term for the study of ancient handwriting, could find no parallels for this handwriting. Another big problem was the grammar. This small scrap contained no fewer than 4 basic violations of Coptic grammar. And really one of the breakthrough discoveries was when I talked about earlier how you could basically create the Gospel of Jesus' Wife by cutting and pasting phrases from the Gospel of Thomas in a different order. It turns out that every single phrase in the Gospel of Jesus' wife can be traced to the Gospel of Thomas, except for two words, my wife. So one of the discoveries that a sort of independent scholar working out of his basement in Portland, Oregon, a guy with nothing more than a master's degree, really smart guy, master's degree from Oxford in the non-canonical Gospels and in study of Coptic and Greek papyri. He noticed that again, he noticed that there were these parallels to the Gospel of Thomas, and he realizes that if this was forged, this must have been done by a forger who maybe had a semester of Coptic, because you wouldn't have to rely on the Gospel of Thomas to write something like this if you were fluent in Coptic. If you were, say, a professor of Coptic, you could just write it fluidly and create something completely new but believable. But the fact that this was a cut and paste job meant that whoever did this had to have relied on some sort of crutch. And there's one obvious crutch for a cut and paste job. And that's what's known as an interlinear translation. So I'm going to geek out for a second here. Interlinear translations are translations in which you have one line of text in a foreign language, and then directly beneath it, sometimes almost word for word beneath the foreign text, you'll have the same words in English. So it's really easy to see how each word and each phrase connects in context to its word in translation. So what this scholar, Andrew Bernhardt in Portland, realized that there was only one interlinear translation that had been done, and it lived on the website of this eccentric retired computer programmer in the Michigan suburbs who was really fond of the Gospel of Thomas. He believes that it contains all these spiritual mysteries, and he's constantly trying to use all these algorithms to figure out whether there are hidden mysteries in the Gospel of Thomas. So Andrew Bernhardt goes to this guy in Michigan's website, downloads the one interlinear Coptic English translation of the Gospel of Thomas, and is looking through it. And he realizes that the Gospel of Jesus' wife contains a typographical error that this guy in Michigan also had in his Microsoft Word typescript of the Gospel of Thomas. So this typo, this grammatical error, does not exist in the actual Coptic Gospel of Thomas. It doesn't exist in the only surviving Coptic edition of the Gospel of Thomas. However, this guy in Michigan makes a mistake when he's transcribing it. He throws in an extra letter, right? And so this extra letter, or this missing letter rather, is also missing from the ancient handwriting of the Gospel of Jesus' wife. So for a lot of scholars, this is one of the smoking guns that a modern forger used a 2002 PDF with a typo in it to basically create a pastiche of the Gospel of Thomas that becomes the Gospel of Jesus' wife. There are a number of other problems, including the 8th century date, which doesn't make any sense because by the 8th century, the carbon-14 dating dated the papyrus fragment itself to the 8th century. And by the 8th century, we're in Islamic Egypt. We're in early Islamic Egypt. We're also at a time when Coptic Christianity is fully Orthodox. So to have a sort of what would be considered sort of heretical text circulating and being copied in Islamic Egypt in the 8th century is kind of a historical problem. And so what scholars have essentially determined, and again, check out this document, I like it. What scholars believe that the prevailing theory, accepted basically almost unanimously, I'd say, is that a modern forger obtained an 8th century piece of papyrus, a blank scrap of papyrus, probably cut it off from some larger sheet of papyrus, and then inscribed Coptic on it with ink whose basic recipe is as easy to follow today as it was in antiquity. All the materials that you need to make it, which is essentially a candle, a burning candle, are as available today as they were in antiquity. So that's the prevailing theory of how the forgery was done.
It's so fascinating and so in-depth. April's curious because this topic is so significant to a lot of very emotionally and religiously charged Christians, to almost to like an extremist state. Have you received any like significantly charged feedback, or what has been the response been to your book and your writing?
It's really been, across the board favorable, I'd say. I think there was such a mystery hanging around this papyrus that when finally, a journalist tried to answer this one unanswered question, there's a sense of relief that, okay, now it all sort of makes sense. I mean, one of the things I also discover about Walter Fritz, the owner, is that he has this really rich personal life. He's an internet pornographer. His wife, he and his wife perform in a genre of internet pornography known as hot wife, in which women are sort of simultaneously sort of deified and desecrated. His wife is also believes that she channels the voices of angels, and self-published a book of universal truths where, again, there's this sort of mixing of kind of Gnostic thinking and then the sexuality, the sort of open, sort of very public sexuality that you see in their internet pornography. So all of this kind of comes together in a weird way in these 8 lines of Coptic. So just to learn more about the background of the forger, who also, of the alleged forger, I should say, he denies forging it, make that very clear, was really eye-opening and for a lot of people. And so I think there was a sense of relief, a sense of discovery, but it's also a very charged issue. This is something that where, there will be certain people on the right, there will be certain evangelicals who will use this to attack the very important scholarship that is being done on women in early Christianity, that will use it to attack feminist scholarship. There are women in academia who are concerned, who are rightly concerned about that sort of attack, the way in which people will weaponize the story. I think if they do try to weaponize the story, it's a complete misreading of the book. And I'll say, very clearly that there's a lot of good evidence for the roles, the leadership roles of women in Christianity. And there's a lot of good scholarship on women in early Christianity. And there's a lot of great feminist scholarship. And I think what's fascinating for me is that the Gospel of Jesus' Wife is not an example of that good evidence and that good scholarship. It's sort of an exception. And sort of the question is, so how and why do things go wrong here? Why does this exception sort of get through when there's so much other great stuff? And that's part of the puzzle that I sought to answer. But yeah, this is touching a nerve for a lot of people. And there's definitely, certainly on social media, a lot of discussion. There are people who sort of love it. There are people who are concerned about the effect on scholarship. But I would say overwhelmingly, it's been a positive response.
And kind of dovetailing off that, Henry has a question about some of the connections you suggest between Dr. King's actions and the debate over the future of divinity school. Would you mind talking about those and explaining your reasoning behind them?
The future of the Harvard Divinity School?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Harvard Divinity School is really interesting place because it is the center of religious study at Harvard. Harvard is distinct among elite universities in that it does not have a freestanding department of religious studies the way a lot of other universities do. It has a divinity school that also houses the better part of religious expertise, scholarly expertise at Harvard. So it has this sort of dual mission of both training ministers, it's not denominational, but training ministers, and then also helping students study religion in a secular way, obtain PhDs, bachelor's degrees. And so it's this weird place where you have the theological study of religion overlapping with the sort of secular study of the practice of religion and of religious history. And there are a lot, and I talk about this at the end of the book, and I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but the Gospel of Jesus' Wife is presented to Dr. Karen King at a crisis point in the Divinity School's history. I didn't know this before starting the book. I didn't know this when I wrote the Atlantic Magazine story. But the Harvard Divinity School is essentially in the crosshairs of the Harvard president at the time that Walter Fritz presents Dr. King with this astonishing papyrus. And so the book explores the way in which this identity crisis, in which this existential threat to the Divinity School is sort of unfolding at a time when it's presented this remarkable find. And in a way, the find exposes these very fault lines in a way that that I think underscores questions that scholars have had for many years about whether the particular mix, the particular approach to the study of religion at Harvard is working or not. And I spoke to a number of scholars who basically bolted from Harvard, top-level scholars who felt like the way that Harvard approaches the study of religion it's too sort of enmeshed, and that it creates a kind of funny relationship between truth seeking and theology that doesn't necessarily serve the study of religion particularly well. Now, there are people at Harvard Divinity School who would vociferously disagree with that, and they're sort of entitled to that view. What I do in the book is present the views of scholars who decided that wasn't particularly a great mix, and then of course counterbalance with those who feel like it's a distinctive feature of the Harvard Divinity School, and they do it well. It's worked for hundreds of years. Why change it now?
Great. Is there a question you'd want readers to have answered when they finish your book? And is there a question you want them to take away?
Well, gosh, I really want readers to think about, I guess in a philosophical sense, what is the nature of truth in the context of religion? That, as I put it in the book, like, does faith need facts? And I think Dr. King is certainly of the belief that doing good history leads to good faith, leads to good Christianity. And other people, I think, would argue that, well, do we when we enter a spiritual realm, when we enter either a private moment of reflection or meditation or spiritual ecstasy, do we need to footnote it? Do we need to sort of nail it all down with the kind of evidence that you'd use in scholarship? Because I think what happens is that the desire to experience faith in a certain way or to tell a certain story about Christianity leads to some funky things when you're trying to pin it down with evidence. And I think we see that both on the progressive side of scholarship and very much on the right evangelical side. I write in the book about the Museum of the Bible, owned by the billionaire evangelical owners of Hobby Lobby. They also tried to tell a certain story about basically the infallibility of the Bible. They were so intent on that story being true that they got rooked by con artists, by forgers, and by looters, and are now having to return thousands of artifacts to Iraq and Egypt. They were fooled by fake Dead Sea Scrolls. So I think what's interesting about this story, and a message I guess I really want folks to take away, because there will be a tendency of people to try to weaponize this one way or the other. This stuff, these forgers and these looters don't discriminate. They are going to identify marks or targets who believe a little too strongly in something, and then they will serve them up exactly what they've always wanted to believe is true, and profit in it from one way or another. In the case of the Green family, the Hobby Lobby folks, I think in that case it was mostly just a desire to make lots of money, and the Greens paid a lot of money for their forged and looted artifacts. In the case of the Gospel of Jesus' Wife, what makes it interesting for me is that I don't think the forger's primary motivation was money. I think that was a secondary or even tertiary motivation. I think their motivation was much more complicated. It had to do with showing up academia. It had to do with embarrassing the Catholic Church. The central figure here, Walter Fritz, claimed to have been sexually abused by a priest when he was a boy. He was also someone who was in a kind of midlife crisis. So there's a lot of different sort of strands of evidence that come together in this case that make it in a way more interesting than a simple case of someone out for a quick buck. That's easy to understand. I'll forge something, sell to an evangelical with lots of money, walk away with a payday. What fascinated me about the Gospel of Jesus' Wife is that the motivations, as I see them, are much more complex.
And speaking of motivations, we have another question from April, who's wondering if you have any thoughts on why Dr. King rushed to reveal the scroll. Was it reckless? Was she just excited? Does she truly believe it's real?
I really feel like that's that's a question I'd really love for readers to answer when they read the book. You asked this really great question earlier about like what tone did you decide to employ while writing the book? And that sense of like giving readers the space to come to their own conclusions. I really don't want to prejudice that. I don't want to put my thumb on the scale. I think there are a number of possible reasons Dr. King might have rushed it out. And I want readers to evaluate that evidence as they get to the end of VERITAS and say, gosh, which was it? Do we even have the ability to look into someone's heart or look into their soul and really ever know? what motivates them. But there's certainly some interesting bits of evidence that I'd love for readers to consider.
Great. And I think I have one question to wrap up the evening with before we all watch the DNC. Chevaliers is based in Los Angeles. Movies are part of our DNA, and the film rights are up for sale for Veritas. Who do you imagine will be cast?
Oh, wow. That's, I
Do you have any
can't say that I have not thought of that. Yeah, I mean, I think it would make a great Hollywood movie. Of course, I would think that. But I mean, gosh, I think certainly, if I were doing the casting, I would say, maybe a Rafe Fiennes. That's how you pronounce his name, for Walter Fritz. And maybe an Elizabeth Moss for a young Karen King. But I'm sure people will have their own ideas. Yes, those film rights are very much available. If you go to my website, the contact section, you will see the agent at the United Talent Agency who's representing those rights. And if folks are interested, of course, they should be in touch. I believe that those rights are now being circulated or looked at by a number of places. So thank you for asking that very LA question.
We have to keep it true. Thank you so much, Ariel, for being here. The book is fantastic. Please drop us a line at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com if you'd like a copy, or go to our bookshop site, and we'll be happy to get it into your hands or into the hands of everyone you know and love. And just thank you again.
Thanks for having me. It was fun. And thanks for all the viewers who took time of their evening to check in.
Wonderful. All right. See you all next time.
Bye.